There's never been so many de-dollarization news in a span of just a few short weeks. From China and Brazil deciding to ditch the dollar, to ASEAN countries considering ditching the dollar and the euro, to India ditching the dollar, with 18 countries to do bilateral trades with. Well, the question is, what's the rush? Actually, it's not a rush. It's been building up for some time. Basically, countries have said enough of the U.S. weaponizing the dollar. Let's take a look at some of the stories coming up in this program. First, de-dollarization. India with 18 nations, including Malaysia, ASEAN countries, as I mentioned, dropping the euro. China, Iran, and Russia obviously have dropped the dollar in their bilateral trade. De-dollarization on the move. Then, rise of the yuan as a result. One of the consequences. Brazil and China trade to be done in yuan, major announcement there. Also China, France, and the LNG transaction to be done in, guess what? The yuan, and China and Saudi Arabia to have announced prior that they will be using the yuan for their energy trade at a minimum. Then the new BRICS currency, or the BRICS currency that's going to be developed, which is said to be a new currency to replace the dollar, is the question. $162 billion in intra-BRICS trade, and BRICS has overtaken the G7 in the global GDP.
More countries around the world are moving away from the US dollar in a bid to reduce their dependence on Washington and prevent it from further exploiting its power and weaponizing its global dollar dominance. The trend is not new, but has accelerated over the past few years. Just recently, China and Brazil have struck a deal to conduct trade transactions in their national currencies, ditching the US dollar as an intermediary. The deal will reduce costs, promote greater bilateral trade, and facilitate investment. China is Brazil's biggest trading partner, with a record $150 billion in bilateral trade last year.
And it's a very significant move because what this signals is that two of the world's largest trading partners are moving concretely towards implementing what is in effect a currency multipolarity framework. It is all about reducing costs, streamlining transactions, and ultimately also reducing risks.
India has also opted to offer its Indian rupee as a trade currency alternative to the US dollar, after it unveiled its latest dynamic and responsive foreign trade policy in a bid for de-dollarization. The Indian rupee will be used in trade countries that are facing a shortage of dollar or currency failure. Last month, China and France conducted the first energy trade in Chinese yuan. Furthermore, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, is mulling dropping the US dollar, euro, and the yen and pound sterling from transaction and moving to settlements in local currencies. And Dilma Rousseff, the president of the new development bank of the group of BRICS countries, has suggested that the group is looking to develop a common currency to counter the dollar.
Over the past so many years, there has been a growing concern around the weaponization of the US dollar, which has created risk and uncertainty for trading partners. And I think that the events of the last 12 months have really hammered home the risks and the need, therefore, for trading partners to mitigate those risks by moves exactly like this.
Time now for the social media post for this section, of which we were looking to see if people out there were even aware of some of the developments that have taken place when it comes to the dollar. First up, France bought 65,000 tons of LNG using the Chinese yuan. The liquefied natural gas was bought from the UAE. The payment settled in the Shanghai Petroleum and Natural Gas Exchange using the Chinese yuan. Went on to say we are witnessing the end of the US dollar hegemony. This particular post, the first step is to provide alternatives. Taking down the dollar hegemony will gradually happen. Naturally, countries would want to hold foreign reserves that are not under the control of the US. Now the Chinese yuan can be used for energy and commodity purchase through the 𝓎𝒶𝓃𝑔. So that's the Chinese commodity exchange for the dollar. Then, is the world saying goodbye to the dollar hegemony? More countries turning to the yuan. We're seeing that being repeated in many of the posts. We move to a website now. The date important, April of 2023 of this year. It said end of the dollar, India using rupees rather than US dollars for international trade. 18 countries agreed to trade in the INR. And then this video was somewhat eye-opening in the way that it had the view when it said the levy breaks, end of the dollar.
Monica, great to see you this morning. What happens if these emerging economies move away from the U.S. dollar towards the Chinese yuan?
It's really hard to overstate exactly how catastrophic the abandonment of the U.S. dollar would be as the world's global reserve currency. That would mean the end of the U.S. dollar.
All right. Tell us what you think about that video. Send us your comments. But first, let me introduce our guest for the first section of our Q&A, 𝓂𝓊𝓁𝒶𝒾. I'm sure I'm not pronouncing it correctly. He's a professor of microeconomics and public administration at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, who joins us. All right, welcome to the program, Daniel. Taking a look at first the major developments surrounding the dollar. You're taking a look at how from India to China to Brazil, and even ASEAN countries, a grouping of a number of countries that are looking, in that case, to dump the euro and the dollar. So that's about 6 big economies there. What impact will that have on the dollar? Does the dollar risk getting replaced, do you think?
Yeah, so basically, this is a very good development for most of those economies that will be able to use their own currencies in bilateral transactions, right? So instead of Brazil, for instance, or Brazilian importers having to buy dollars in order to sell those dollars for yuans, right, and then buy Chinese goods, you can simply sell your own domestic currency, the real, and try to get yuan sellers to sell you those currencies. And those arrangements are much cheaper, right? Because you don't have to pay someone who has dollars in order to have to acquire dollars just as one step before you can make a payment in another country. It used to be that almost every transaction required dollars as an intermediary currency. And so much of these arrangements are simply cost-effective solutions.
All right, thank you so much. By the way, he mentioned the real there. We in the Islamic Republic, the administration headed by Raisi is very keen on making sure that production is actually increasing in order to give a rise or increase the value of the real, which is the value of, or that's the currency that is used in the Islamic Republic. All right, next up, Professor Zhang Xizhu joins us. He's the director of the Center for Latin American Studies at Shanghai University. Professor Zhang Xizhu, welcome to Economic Divide. Right now, there's a strong momentum for the yuan that is said to, well, they're saying to dethrone the dollar. And the reason for that, in one respect, is the energy sector, where you're having countries such as France, for example, completing its first LNG transaction in the yuan, also Saudi Arabia that is either doing that or is mulling to do that, and GCC countries of the Persian Gulf to do the same. How will that impact the dollar, do you think?
I think that kind of new developments will certainly hit the dominance of the US dollar in a certain way. Because many people wish to use their own currencies for international trade, for payment system, all kinds of things. But however, we have to point out that if you really want to kill the dollar, let me use the word kill. If we want to kill the dollar, we have to replace it with our own currencies, okay? Now, for the time being, I have to point out that our own currency is not so strong. Look at the Chinese currency. Well, over the past 1 decade, our currency for the RMB yuan has become all the more internationalized. But until now, I don't believe that the Chinese currency is strong enough to replace the dollar.
Time now for the Info News section of the program. We take a look at 4 pieces of news with an economic flavor to it. First up, taking a look at a very important meeting that took place this past week, and that was between the French President Emmanuel Macron and von der Leyen from the EU, and with the Chinese President Xi Jinping. This was an important meeting. This is what China's President Xi Jinping said. He hopes that Europe will pursue a pragmatic and positive China policy and will form more independent, objective understanding of China. Who do you think that message is for? That message is for the U.S. Make no mistake. Another thing that the Chinese president has said, China-EU ties are not targeted at, dependent on, or controlled by any third party. Again, a message to the U.S. And finally, we have to take a look at why this is important. First of all, China, according again to this piece of news, revealed how it's the largest trading partner for EU imports of goods in the year 2022. And also China is the 3rd largest partner for EU exports of goods. So when you take a look at that piece of stat, it puts into context this visit by the French president and EU's von der Leyen as to the message both are sending on the behalf of Europe when they're forging ties with China on an economic level, the message that sends to the US. And sure enough, right before, an hour before we came to record this program, this is the piece of breaking news that came out, where now the French President Emmanuel Macron has said Europe must cut the reliance on the US dollar and to seek strategic autonomy, where it said the French President called on European countries to lower their dependence on the US dollar and to resist pressure to become vassal states of Washington or take sides in the China-US conflict over Taiwan. So you see that important development coming out of this meeting. All right, next up, a developing story, the U.S. banking crisis is still continuing. The U.S. banking crisis, according to J.P. Morgan, is not over. The Wall Street Bank expects to see repercussions, according to J.P. Morgan, for years to come. It said that it will clearly cause some tightening of financial conditions as banks and other lenders have become more conservative. Check out our program on the banking crisis on the website presstv.ir. Next up, taking a look at the oil cut. This again is a big snub to the U.S., where OPEC Plus has announced a surprise based on many accounts of oil output cuts. Saudi Arabia and other OPEC Plus members announced cuts that will be around 1.16 million barrels per day. Of course, the U.S. is dismayed about the move. Gas prices, as a result, will increase following the announcement. We have seen some increases in the U.S. as we're monitoring this, but not so much. But based on this particular oil price cut, I'm sure prices will increase at the pump. Next up, taking a look at Iran's economy. Now, this is important because we're having the Iran-Saudi relationship be elevated to the next level. First, they have announced setting up a joint chamber of commerce, obviously following that diplomatic agreement. Also, within the context of Iran's economy and that important development, Iran has signed $80 billion worth of oil deals with foreign investors to participate in the financing of oil projects. So we're already seeing the momentum being put into motion, the economic wheels of Iran to start turning the way that they should, because $80 billion is nothing to laugh at. If you have a piece of news from your part of the world where you think we should cover in this program, please make sure you drop us a line. Contact information is on your screens now. Time now for the in-depth section of the program. So what's the big deal about the news on the dollar? Is it really in trouble? Well, we've told you about how other countries are de-dollarizing, but what has not been discussed is how the dollar is even affecting the U.S. itself, making it toxic. So let's find out how that's happening. First, right now the dollar is extremely strong. As a result, it is pushing down the world with it. The value of the U.S. dollar is the strongest that it has been in a generation, and that comes with consequences. Some of the consequences: it is devaluing currencies around the world and unsettling the outlook for the global economy. It's upending things from the cost of a vacation, as an example, to the profitability of multinational companies. That is a big deal. Next, well, the main way to gauge the dollar's strength is by indexing it against a basket of currency major trading partners. For example, Japan or maybe the Eurozone. Now, by that measure, the dollar is at a 20-year high. This graph is testament to that. After gaining more than 10% this year, a huge move for an index that typically shifts by just tiny fractions each day. And finally, we talked about the multinational U.S. companies, well, American companies with large international operations. They are taking a hit when they convert foreign sales back into dollars. Profits at both Microsoft and Nike, for example, well, they have recently eroded. Apple is generating more than 60% of its sales outside of the United States, so obviously that's going to take a hit. And other tech giants, well, they are taking a hit from this and are likely to suffer from the dollar's strength when they reveal their latest financial results. That's coming up in a matter of weeks. Hopefully we'll have an update for you then. Let me bring back our guests for this program to find out what they think. Daniel 𝓂𝓊𝓁𝒾 joins us. 𝓂𝓊𝓁𝒾 joins us. He's a professor of microeconomics and public administration of the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. Daniel, welcome back to Economic Divide. So when you take a look at the fact that more and more countries are looking to replace the dollar, and that's coming out almost every other day, when you take a look at the strong message that other countries are sending, what kind of impact, by the way, so many countries so far is said to be the case, what kind of impact is that going to have on the U.S. economy, do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a very strong statement, right, to say that it would destroy the U.S. economy. Of course, much of the U.S. economic power came from the fact that it was the leading exporter of currency, right, which is something that we don't usually think about. But if you have a lot of countries that demand your currency because it is the most widespread reserve currency for storing wealth, right? It's also the required currency for making payments internationally. Then it gives you the opportunity to get goods in exchange for the currency that you can create out of nothing, right? Which is basically the U.S.'s condition.
All right, let's bring back Professor Zhang Shizhu. He's the director of the Center for Latin American Studies at Shanghai University. Professor Zhang Shizhu, welcome back to Economic Divide. The dollar dominance obviously is now beyond just being challenged. Countries are putting aside the dollar, some are putting the figure at 70 countries so far. Do you think it's fair to say that the U.S. economy is going to somewhat not only be affected but decimated as a result?
Well, first of all, I want to say that this is a kind of a very important story because in the world today, many people are complaining about the superior dominance of the U.S. dollar on the world economic stage. Now, if you want to have your currency as the global currency for everybody to use in terms of trade and investment, you must be very responsible for all kinds of actions you are going to take. But the reality has shown clearly that the U.S. has failed to be a very responsible country. although it has its the important currency. So I believe that that's why we can see that so many countries wish to see that the dollar should be done away, or should be replaced by some kind of other currencies. This is a very welcome development.
China, Iran, Russia, and Venezuela have proven earlier that they can live without the dollar. What really matters is that powerful countries like China and Russia are major players in the de-dollarization process today. The dominance of the US dollar in international trade and finance has given the US significant economic power and has allowed to exert influence over other countries through sanctions and other economic tools. If the de-dollarization trend continues, it could undermine this power and make it more difficult for the US to achieve its foreign policy goals.
Hello and welcome to the Quick Take section. I'm 𝒂𝓃. In this part of the program, we are going to talk about the de-dollarization. The US dollar has long played an outsized role in global markets. It continues to do so even as the American economy has been producing a shrinking share of global output over the last 2 decades. However, central banks aren't holding the greenback in their reserves to the extent that they once did. According to the IMF, the dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves fell below 59% in the final quarter of the last year. This was the dollar's lowest share of global reserves since 1994. The yuan has surpassed the euro to become the second largest currency in the foreign reserves of Brazil, South America's biggest country. As China's 10th largest trading partner and the key supplier of iron ore and soybeans, it is increasingly using the yuan for settlements in trade and investment, largely because of Western sanctions and being excluded from much of the global financial system. Russians have also turned to the yuan as the currency of choice. It has replaced the US dollar as the most traded currency in the country, with almost all the big banks offering services and deposits in the yuan. Here's a summary of them in no particular order. In March, India ditched the dollar to trade in Indian rupees with 18 nations, including Malaysia. The Islamic Republic of Iran, sanctioned by the US, has fully abandoned dollar in its trade with Russia and China. Saudi Arabia has declared it will abandon the petrodollar and accept the petro-yuan. Brazil and China inked an agreement to trade in the Chinese yuan and ditch the dollar. China is working to pitch yuan as an alternative to the dollar. It's promoting the yuan through BRICS, ESCO, and OPEC. Russia is using the yuan in international trade. It's working to launch a joint BRICS currency. ASEAN countries are looking to drop the euro and the dollar, and Chinese national oil company 𝓎𝓐𝓁 have completed China's first yuan-settled LNG trade.
There's a broader trend towards reduced role of the dollar in terms of just a trend in the international trade. But on top of this, I think a lot of countries have seen and have observed how the dollar has been weaponized by Washington to be used in a political means. And I think there are many, many examples of that.
That's the end of this Quick Take section on the current status of dollar as the global reserve currency. Don't forget to send us your comments and questions. I'm 𝒂𝓃, and I'll see you next week.
In June 2022, Russia's ruble hit its strongest level in 7 years, despite massive sanctions that have been exercised against that country. So much so that Russia's central bank had to take measures to try to weaken it, fearing that this will make the country's exports less competitive. The ruble's stunning surge in the following months is being cited by the Kremlin as proof that Western sanctions are not working. Now, add to that countries ditching the dollar, the days of the U.S. weaponizing the dollar may be numbered. By the way, don't forget the dollar is fiat money, not backed by any physical asset. That does it for this edition of the program. I know we've covered a lot of programs on the dollar, but so many developments, we figured we need to relay that to you. Tell us if we made a good decision or not. Contact information is behind me. From 𝓂𝓊𝓁𝒶𝒾 and the entire team at the Economic Divide, it's goodbye until the next program.